With that, I'm going to announce and introduce our morning keynote. Mr. Eric Fenner is here with us this morning. He is well known in the field of child welfare. We are very, very honored to have him here and greatly appreciate his journey across the country. He recently retired as the director of Franklin County Children's Services in Columbus, Ohio. He spent 32 years public service, including stints with the county juvenile court system, the County Department of Jobs and Family Services, and he's spent over 20 years in child welfare. He's going to talk with us this morning about the importance of coaching, especially with the millennials. We all know retention. We hear overwhelmingly that new staff want coaching. Right? They want coaching, they want support, they want guidance. And I think that's why there is such great energy here in the room, is because we know coaching is the right thing to do. And it's one of the things that we hope really will help combat some of the staff retention issues that I know many of you are facing. I know we're struggling with it here in Northern California, and I think it's going on across the country, or I know it's going on across the country. Millennials comprise a big part of our workforce, and they are the ones who are asking for this kind of coaching. We know from our supervisors that they oftentimes wish that they had coaching when they were junior social workers just starting out in the field. We're really appreciative of Mr. Fenner being here for his support, and let's give him a good welcome.
Well, good morning. See, clearly there are not enough young people in here, because when I speak to young people and I say good morning, they generally respond with a little bit more enthusiasm. So let's try it again. Good morning.
Good morning.
There we go. Let me start with a little funny story. Every time I walk to a podium, I'm reminded of a conversation I had with my daughter when she was I think she was 5 years old, and she was graduating into middle school. And she was picked to be one of the kids who was going to speak, and it was about careers or something. And she was so nervous. And the podium had wheels on it. And so I could see my baby standing up there, kind of gliding back and forth. But before she asked me she said, I'm going to be speaking in front of everyone, all the parents, and I'm really nervous, so what points can you give me that would help ease my mind a bit? And I said, well, here's what you do. My daughter's tall, as you can imagine. She's now about 6 foot tall. Back then, I think she was probably 5'6", but she was taller than all the boys, everybody in her classroom. And she was a little in that awkward stage. And I told her, here's what you have to concentrate on, sweetheart. The most important thing is to make it to the podium. I said, as a tall person, I tell myself, I can be nervous from my seat to the podium. And that's half of the battle, because if I trip and fall on my way to the podium, it doesn't matter how good my speech is, no one's going to remember it. All they'll remember is that I fell on my way to the podium. So I said to her, concentrate, really concentrate on making it to the podium. And once you get to the podium, you can release all your anxiety, because everything is gravy from that point. And so this morning when I came up, of course, a smart guy would have walked around and used the stairs, but I took the 8-foot leap here, and I thought, here's where that rule is really being tested. Okay, let me first say that these are really difficult times to be in child welfare, to be in public service. The fact that you all have made this decision to make this be a part of your career, I think is really special. I don't think there's ever been a time where coaching is more important than it is right now. Now, I'm going to talk about my experiences with millennials. And if it's okay, I'd really prefer to say young people. Millennial sounds like a different species. And I know that sometimes that's how we treat them. But at the end of my talk with you today, I think I'm going to change some of your minds about that. And really, that's my goal today, to really, I'm not going to give you any how-tos in coaching, but I am going to talk about why coaching is so important and the role that it can play in improving child welfare. Now, just as a little test, I looked this up. Here's the other thing. I see speakers and they have these clean sheets of paper in front of them when they're giving speeches. This is mine. I had this all done until I sat at this table and started talking, and then I even made more changes, so bear with me. According to the internet, millennials are young people born after 1980. So, I'm not going to ask you your specific age, because I know that's inappropriate, but how many of you were born after 1980? Raise your hands. Okay, that's not bad. Now, on the flip side, it's a group called baby boomers. All right? Now, baby boomers were born between 1946 and 1964. How many baby boomers are we in here? Okay. I'm in that category also. And what I'm going to do, I'm going to talk to you about three things. First, I've got to set this up. For you to appreciate my experience working with young people, you're where?
I said you left out the Gen Xers. Yeah.
Okay. How many Gen Xers are there in the room? There goes my speech, right? Okay, let me set this up, because what I'm going to say actually will work with Gen Xers too. It better, right? I'm going to give you a little bit of background, my background, simply because I think it helps you to understand how I come to the thoughts that I have and the way that I behave and the way that I see child welfare. I'm going to talk a little bit about the experience we had at Franklin County Children's Services with our turnover and how it really opened our eyes about who the people were in our organization. Isn't it interesting how, until we started to really look deeply at the incredible turnover rate we had of our child welfare caseworkers, we really weren't paying much attention to who our caseworkers were. And then I'm going to end with a couple areas where I think coaching could really make a difference, not just in stabilizing our workforce, but also in improving the work that our people do in the field. So, first, how many of you were or are frontline caseworkers? You knock on the doors, you talk to families, workers, yes, okay. I started as a child welfare caseworker with Franklin County Children's Services in the intake department, investigating abuse and neglect. I did that work for 8 years. It was such a different environment. Most of the coaching that I received wasn't from my supervisor. It was from the veteran workers in the unit. These were the people who really taught me what it was that I was supposed to do. We had what I will reference several times during this talk. Our frontline supervisors did what I call checklist management or checklist supervision. You know, when you go in to sit down with your supervisor and they have a checklist, did you do this, did you do this, did you do that? Rarely was there a conversation with you about what you saw, what you experienced, you know, your plan. When, even when the supervisor would go over your case plan, it was still through a checklist. Did you do this? Did you do that? As opposed to a conversation about that family. I then became a frontline supervisor. And what did I do? Checklist supervision. Why? Because that's what everybody else was doing. I then became a trainer, and I trained workers and supervisors, and guess how I trained them on? Checklist supervision. I was interested in leadership. And back in the day that I came on board, in order for you to move up, the people in front of you either had to die or they retired, right? I mean, you know, people weren't just moving around. If you were a frontline supervisor and you wanted to be an administrator, you had to hit every rung in that ladder. There was no skipping a rung. And so I didn't think I had enough life left to make it to an administrator waiting on all the people in front of me that had to die before I could move up. So I chose to leave and go someplace else. I went to the Department of Human Services, and that's where we have food stamps and income maintenance and so forth, and I was the deputy director there. I then left there and I went to the juvenile court as a court administrator, and I worked for 5 judges. Any court administrators in the room? How about lawyers? Oh, this is going to be fun. This is going to be fun. I actually enjoyed working for judges, but they were very clear about what their role was and what my role was. I remember, and then I'm going to get off the court. I remember, because this stands out so much in my mind, I remember making a suggestion to an administrative judge that we look at the number of children who were being maintained in the detention center by judges' courtroom. See, when you're young, you don't have that fear that you have when you get older of other people. And this administrative judge looked at me and she said, Eric, you are the court administrator. You know what your primary role is here? Make sure the lights are on in the morning and the lights are off when we finish up at the end of the day. I think I could have walked out of there, you know, probably about that tall. The reason why I mention that is because we need to be very aware of the things we say to young people. Because you can destroy a person, or you can create a time frame for that person's development that gets severely retarded by just a simple comment like that. Now, I was filled with blank and vinegar as a young person, so that didn't crush me, but it did bother me, because I couldn't understand why the fact that I was a new and young administrator, that what I had to say wouldn't be considered relevant or important to the organization. I filed that one away. Okay, I left the court, and then I went to the private sector a little bit, because everybody says the private sector has everything figured out. You know, if you go to the private sector, all of this bureaucracy and politics that you see in public service, it's not going to be in the private sector. Completely, completely false. I ran one of the largest foster care group home networks at that time in Franklin County. It was called the Ohio Youth Advocate Program. And so I had a chance to see children in foster care from the perspective of foster parents. All these experiences really helped me when I became an executive director. I then went back to Franklin County Children's Services as the deputy executive director in charge of all of our programs and administration and all that fancy stuff. And I did that for about 4 years, and I really enjoyed that. There was something about being the number 2, because in my agency, my director really allowed me a lot of flexibility. And what I came to realize, how much I appreciated that, was because if I screwed up, he would get fired. You know, because in county government, at least in Franklin County, the only job that's not protected is the executive director. The deputy director's job is a classified position, and it's protected. So every once in a while, he would tease me and say, you know, if this doesn't work, I'm going to get fired. And I don't think he realized that that really wasn't a motivator for me, you know? Okay. After 4 years, and things were going really, really well, the executive director called me and said, I've decided that I'm going to retire, and you should consider throwing your hat in the ring for the executive director's job. My career goal was to be the deputy executive director, because that's where all the action was. That's where the workers were, that's where the work was. The executive director had a lot of political stuff to deal with. You had to deal with the budgets, you had to deal with the county commissioners, you had to deal with the state legislature, media, all of that mess. And so I wanted to stay there. And so he said, listen, here's what you need to think about. If you don't go for the executive director's job, someone else will come in, and I can tell you nobody's going to give you the flexibility that I did. And he was probably right. So I went for the executive director's job, and we did a national search. I was the first African-American executive director of Franklin County Children's Services, an organization that had been around for 75 years and had over 65% of the children in care were African-Americans, and there had never been an executive director who was African-American. What was interesting was how my position, my being named, was received in the community. Some of it was comical. I mean, I don't know if people thought I was going to come to work that Monday with a dashiki and grow my hair. I said, the children in this community is our collective responsibility. Our collective responsibility. What we have to understand is who they are, where they are, and what do they need. And we will categorize our resources and deploy our resources based on the greatest need for the children in our community. It's really that simple. But we had two big challenges. The first one was that our turnover rate of caseworkers was almost 40%. Almost 40%. And our caseworkers, 48% of all of our caseworkers, 48%, almost half, were under the age of 25. Under the age of 25. Now, at the time, I didn't realize that these two things were interrelated. The turnover rate and the workers that were under the age of 25. Let me tell you something. This generation of millennials or Generation Xers, they view the world quite differently than the way we did. When I was a worker in my 20s, I never let go of one vine until my hand was firmly on the next vine, right? I didn't quit a job until I knew I had another job. Not these folks. They will get mad at noon, and by 5 o'clock, they have packed up there and they are gone. All right? And part of it is because where will they go? They will go back home. I can remember hearing my father's screwdriver changing the locks on the door as I left home. This generation doesn't see it that way. They always come back home. And parents, we mumble about it, we gripe about it, but we open that door wide for them to come back in. So, what we had to do was recognize, wait a minute, if we have almost 40-some% turnover rate, and almost 50% of them, of our workers are millennials, we need to find out why are these people leaving. Now, interesting fact, most organizations who do their surveys and look into why people are leaving, they talk to the people who are staying. They talk to the people that are in the organization. That to me really made no sense. The people who are staying always talk about leaving, but they don't ever go anywhere. You ever notice that? They complain about the money, they complain about this, they complain about the heat in the building, but they don't go anywhere. The ones who don't say anything, they leave skid marks in the parking lot. Now, we went through and did a survey, not just a paper survey, but we called every worker who left within a 6-month period. And we said, listen, we have your official reason for leaving on your exit survey. And we waited at least 30 days. Why? Because we wanted to make sure they got their last paycheck and they didn't feel like somehow we were going to penalize them with what we owed them. So we would wait until they got all that, and then we would ask them, what is your unofficial reason for leaving? The real reason why you're leaving. Not one person said, I'm leaving because I don't like the executive director. It wasn't me. What was interesting was that the reason why people were leaving was because they didn't feel appreciated. They didn't feel valued. They didn't feel heard. They didn't feel that they were a part of the work. They didn't feel that they made a difference. When I reported to my board, most of my board thought that the number one reason for people leaving was what? Money. It wasn't. You see, these folks know what the job pays before they get here. I knew what the job paid when I got my first paycheck. Really, I knew what the job paid when I got my first paycheck. These folks already know what the job pays. So for them, when they come into child welfare, they're not coming because of what the job pays. Let me tell you another really interesting point that I learned, and I meant to say this earlier. What's really important is that there's clarity, particularly for young people, about why the work is important, the why of what they do. The why of what they do is more important than the what and the how. Why? I used this slide that I used to use in a lot of my leadership presentations that I said, people follow you not because of what you do, but because of why you do it. Let me tell you something else that I found interesting about young people. If the why is clear for them, why we're doing what we're doing, what they are willing to do in the work is unbelievable. Absolutely unbelievable. But if the why isn't clear, you know what happens? They go someplace where the why is clear. Here's another interesting fact we learned. Most of the people who left child welfare didn't leave the field of child welfare, they just left us. They went to the hospitals to become social workers. They became social workers in courts or in schools or wherever. They went to other places where they could still engage in working with families and children, but just not with us. Their preference was to be with us. But we created such an environment that was so toxic for them that they would leave. Now, here's another thing. We started pulling our young people together soon thereafter, because with all of this information, this became really important for us. Guess what the number 3 reason why people left? This jumped off the page at us. The relationship with their frontline supervisor. The relationship with their frontline supervisor. In fact, what we started to do, we started to look at turnover rate by unit. And what we found interesting was that we'd have a unit over here that served the same random assigned referrals, and they hadn't had a worker leave in 3 years, and we had a unit over here getting the same kinds of cases, and that unit had turned over 3 times in 3 years. There's something wrong with that supervisor. And to me, it made no sense to continue to pour good resources down a bottomless well. We need to find someplace else for that supervisor. Or at least train them, coach them up, talk them up, whatever it is we needed to do. But this person was killing us. And it was amazing to me how long that had been going on, and we didn't deal with it. Here's another thing, another point that folks started to point out. They would say, why is she or he allowed to treat people that way? I mean, you know it. The unit is turned over 3 times in 3 years. Why is it that we're allowing that behavior to continue? So we have to put a stop to that. But all those things that I read off to you, the reasons why those people were saying they were leaving, we could do something about all of that. And none of that was going to cost us a dime. Think about this. How you engage with people that you supervise, treating people with respect and consideration, listening to what they have to say about the work they're doing, doesn't cost you anything. A little bit more time. But you know what? Here's the other thing that I will tell you. For those of us who are baby boomers, I always find this interesting. The way I was raised by my parents was children were to be seen and not right. The way we raise our children is that they are included. We talk to our children about where we're going to go on vacation. Your parents ever talk to you about where you were going on vacation? We talk to our children about where we're going to go on vacation. We talk to our children about what kind of clothes they want to wear. In fact, many of us let our children dress themselves in elementary school. And some of it you can tell, right? But think about that. We have dinner conversations and our children are encouraged to participate. We ask them how their day was. We watch movies with our children and talk about what's happening in the movie. We encourage our children to talk to us about the relationship they have with their friends, even in elementary school. We talk with our children about bullies, stranger danger. We engage in our children in conversations, a completely different approach to parenting than what we had as children coming up. So then when these young people grow up, go to college, get their degrees, and come to work in the workforce, we're surprised that, can you believe she's asking me these questions? This is how they were raised. They were raised to be involved. They were raised to be engaged. My youngest, now 23 years old, my daughter, even with 2 boys older than her, my relationship with her was very different. My wife should put that app on her phone, that snapping of the whip, because my daughter has me wrapped around her finger, I'll admit it. She's spoiled, but she's not a brat. At least that's what I say. But the conversations that I have with her as she graduated from college and was going to work were really about not just the work itself, but to understand the why of the work. What's the connection between you and the work that you want to do? Because if you find that connection in the work that you choose to do, to who you are as a person, you never work a day in your life. And it doesn't matter what field it is. If you are connected to that work, you don't feel like you're working ever. We have got to figure out a way in many of our organizations to make that connection with young people. When they walk into our organizations, they're prepared to do that. That's what they want to do. That's what they want. But we have this tendency to treat them the way our parents treated us versus the way we treat our own children. It's a fascinating dynamic to watch that interplay. When we began to have these conversations with our workers, it was pretty incredible. I mean, twice a year, we would have all staff meetings, and we'd have to do 3 of them because we didn't have a room big enough to have everybody in. But I wanted there to be an opportunity for the executive director to be in front of our staff. And at the end of those meetings, I would always say, are there any questions? Those baby boomers in that audience have been sitting in those audience for years. They never said a word. Those young people, their hands would go right up. They had an expectation that what they had to ask was important as what anybody else in the room had to ask. What became almost comical was that they expected me to know who they were too, right? Like, we know who you are as executive director, but you should know who we are. And I used to say, you know, we have over 1,000 of you, there's only one of me, so I'm never gonna know each and every one of you. But it was fascinating to me that their expectation was that they were going to be involved. But why should that surprise us? These children grew up riding in cars with baby on board in the back window. Why would we be surprised that these young people have an expectation that they matter? I mean, for crying out loud, we used to clap when my daughter would poop, right? So if you're getting applause for pooping, how can you not think that when you come out into the workforce, people are going to want to know what you have to say? The beauty of it is that is your opportunity to teach. It's your opportunity for them to learn how to be good child welfare caseworkers. I remember one time we had a unit where there was a young worker who was very concerned about this family, and they had this dirty house. And this worker was so concerned about this dirty house that she solicited several workers in her unit, and on a Saturday, they all went out and cleaned this woman's house. No overtime, no money that we spend even for the supplies. And I heard about that, and I thought, that's incredible. So I asked the supervisor, the next unit meeting, could I be invited? Would you let me come? Don't tell your unit that I'm going to be there. So I came to their meeting, and I said, listen, folks, I appreciate what you've done, but that's not what I want you to do. You see, we have to teach our families, our parents, how to clean their own homes. Because if you clean their house, guess what? Unless you're going to do it next week and the week after and the week after, that becomes an expectation. Demonstrate your support and your concern for them by teaching them. Now, we can contract with an organization that can make a big difference here, and they can do that training for that parent. Another example that was really interesting. We used to do parent training. How many of you have had contracts for parent training? See, some of you don't want to raise your hand because you think I'm going to say something bad about it. Those 12-week parent training programs are probably the biggest waste of your money you've ever spent. Ever spent. We used to also have, we'd look at our data, and at our intake office, children under the age of 3 were placed 25% of the time. So I went to our intake department and had an open meeting with the staff and said, what resource would you want that you could have access to within 24 hours, that if a child is 50-50, which is completely, you know, what does that really mean? But if you were close in your decision about whether this child should go home or whether this child should go into foster care, what would be the service, if you could have access to it within 12 to 24 hours, that you would say, that'll work? There were two. One was someone who could help clean a house and teach a parent how to clean a house. But the second was really a visiting nurse type who could come in and check the child's vitals and so forth, make sure they're getting proper food and that kind of thing. And I said, it's cheaper for us to pay for that. Okay, the budget person in me says, it's cheaper for us to pay for that than to put that child in foster care. But not only that, if we can reduce trauma in our families even a little bit, we have to do it. Because here's the point. Here's the point. Once a child has been removed, the trauma to that family does not ever go away. It doesn't, I mean, we need to be aware of that. And listen, I don't want you to walk out of here saying that Eric Fenner said, don't remove children from their homes. Okay? Some children absolutely need to be removed for their own protection. But I can guarantee you, if I walked in your agencies, I would find a good percentage of children that you remove from their homes that don't need to be. And what we're not realizing, sometimes we are so concerned with covering our own asses and what the media is going to say, that we make decisions that are detrimental to the families that we serve. And we've got to stop that. So when we put in place this contract, we reduced our children in care, that 0 to 3 population, by almost half inside of the first 6 months. Now, folks, we don't have crystal balls. Stop pretending like you do. All we can do is make decisions with the information that's in front of us. And this is the second point that I want to make about coaching. When we engage in coaching with our workers, particularly our young people, we help them to develop critical thinking skills. Now, listen to this. I don't care how good your professor was in undergraduate school, and I don't care how good the trainer was that you've been attending in your child welfare training programs. When you are in a home with a hostile and aggressive and mad parent, all that theory goes right out the window. Self-preservation kicks in. And if you have engaged in conversations with your frontline supervisor about what to look for, how to behave, what to say, exit strategies, it will be far more beneficial to you. But you won't get there if you just have checklist supervision. You get there if you have conversations with your supervisors about what you're seeing in families and where you see those dangers. It is critically important. And we don't do enough of that. For young people, that's their opportunity to share with you what they see. I've had a chance to see some really good supervisors. So good that I've just wanted to take them around the country with me, because I've also seen some very bad supervisors. But these good supervisors, when they're talking to their workers and you listen to them and they're asking questions like, so how did you feel when the mother said what she said to her daughter? How did that make you feel? Or who's the authority in the home? Not just is there food in the cupboard, where is everybody sleeping, did they have clean? Start to engage more around those relationships and allow that worker to delve deeper into what they're seeing and what they're experiencing. All of that is learning. Mike Tyson had a great response when he was about to fight Michael Spinks. I'll never forget it. They asked Mike Tyson, say, well, you know, Mike, Michael Spinks has a plan for how he's going to fight you. He's going to, when you charge, he's going to come under you, he's going to throw the hook, he's going to throw the uppercut. And Mike Tyson just sat there and says, listen, everybody's got a plan until they get hit. When our caseworkers leave our buildings and go out into the field, they've got a plan. They've got a plan. But until they get into a home with a hostile and aggressive parent, and they get hit with that for the first time, that plan goes right out the window. We have to talk to our workers about that inevitability, because it's a matter of when, not if. I can remember as a caseworker, Christmas Eve, get a call in at 4 o'clock. Don't they always come in Christmas Eve at 4 o'clock, right? So back in the time that I was a worker, working at intake was a big deal. I mean, the cream of the crop worked at intake. And so I worked at intake, okay? And so we get a referral that there's no food in the house, the child's not being properly cared for, so I go out, knock on the door. Old man opens the door, shotgun in hand. Shotgun in hand. You know what I said? I said, oh, this is 48:24. I'm supposed to be at 24:48. How did I learn that? My supervisor said, when in doubt, when it looks hot, when it looks dangerous, get away from there right away. You can always retreat, call the police, call the office. Back in that day, to tell you a little bit about my age, used to keep in your ashtray was filled with dimes. You know why? Because there was a time that a dime could get you a phone call. Now, it's like when I show my daughter a record player or an 8-track player, she's like, Dad, what is that? We didn't have cell phones and pagers, so you would go, but there were pay phones everywhere. And you would go to the pay phone and you would call the police and have them come up. If I don't have that experience, and some of our young people tend to believe that they've got to drive on through that they've got to conduct that investigation. They put themselves at unnecessary risk. But if you talk with them about the possibility of what could go wrong, let me tell you something. My supervisor, Roz Mizell, I will never forget her. In my first week on the job, because we didn't have trainings right away, you started on Monday, you got cases on Monday. And that's where it was. Sometimes 3, 4, 5 cases. But she sat me down and she said, when you go out to homes, here are a couple things you want to make sure you keep in mind. First and foremost, don't go deep into a house. Stay near the front door. Keep your back to the front door. The other thing she said, make sure that you look around for things that could be used as projectiles. See, back in the day when people smoked, they used to have these big ceramic ashtrays. She used to always say, don't go near a fireplace. Stay in the middle of the room. Don't go into a basement with no back door. Don't get trapped upstairs. I mean, all of these were things. The other thing that she said to me, I'll never forget, she used to say, when you go out on a home visit, ride by the address first. See who's standing around. See who's outside. If it doesn't look safe, come back to the office and we'll figure out something else. How many of you as supervisors have told your workers, when you go out, if it doesn't look safe, don't worry about it, come back, we'll develop another plan? Thank you. Because so many places, supervisors don't tell their workers that, and they figure, hey, this is a 24-hour contact, I'm in the 22nd hour, I've got to make this contact. No, you don't. No, you don't. Safety to our workers is our primary responsibility. Why am I so passionate about that? Because on October 16th, 2001, we had a child welfare caseworker brutally murdered on a home visit, stabbed to death on a home visit. In an organization that went 50 years with never having a worker so much as being touched by a client, we had a worker brutally murdered. Now, the person had stopped taking their medication, they were having a psychotic episode, but none of that was clear to her on that first day. I think about her all the time. Now, that's not the standard, folks, okay? That's not generally what's going to happen. But workers do get hit. They do get punched. They do get kicked. They do get spat upon. What we have to do is teach our workers how to avoid those confrontations. That comes through the critical thinking that happens in coaching as opposed to that checklist supervision. Now, the other piece where I think coaching makes a big difference is workforce development, which leads to retention. If workers are being developed, they're going to stay. But if you are just going through a checklist of supervision and not engaging in a conversation with those workers, you will lose them. You will lose them because they will go someplace where the organization is invested in their development. And I'm not just talking about development because you've got a good training program, and Ohio has one of the best child welfare training programs in the country. There's no question about that. But the learning that takes place between that worker and that supervisor is critically important. You know, nationally, the turnover rate of child welfare caseworkers is anywhere between 20 and 40%, and some places even higher. At some point, what we're going to start to have are people who really aren't interested in doing anything but getting a job. They just want a job. I'm seeing in some places where the decision is made to, this is a really horrible way to describe it, but for the sake of speed, I'll say it, dummy down child welfare. Moving away from 4-year degrees for caseworkers, going to 2-year degrees, or looking at age requirements. There is a reason why we want educated people in child welfare. The assessment process is an engaged process that requires skills that allow you to gather critical information and then act on it. Having a bunch of workers with very little training and very little education just to have someone see a child, that's not the answer. We used to call those drive-by home visits. You know, where you would basically go by the home. Hi, Miss Jones, everything going okay? Where's Sally? Let me see Sally. Sally looks okay. Thank you. 15 minutes, you're out the door. We need to recognize that this is a skilled job. There's a reason why a bachelor's in social work is generally the baseline for what you need to come into it. The last piece of coaching that I want to stress has to do with child safety. A child is only as safe as the decisions that are made by that caseworker. The caseworker's decisions are only as good as the authority they're granted by their supervisor. The supervisor's decision on that authority is only as good as the information that the worker gives that supervisor. What makes for good decisions? Good information. It's as simple as that. You know, I remember one time listening to a very successful basketball coach, and the reporter said, "Coach, what makes you such a good coach?" He said, "I have good players." Making good decisions comes from having good information. And when workers engaged in conversations, and listen, understand something, coaching, the simplest definition of coaching is a conversation between the coach and the coachee, where the coach is trying to teach the coachee how to make decisions that resolve issues on their own. It's about the engagement of that conversation. If workers are learning how to gather good information and then have a conversation with their supervisor about the information that they have, and if the supervisor asks good questions that pull that information out, that family will get a good decision from that casework team, and perhaps you'll reduce the trauma on that family. So often I see workers who are basically responding to questions from their supervisors with no conversation. It's just yes, no, yes, no. If you engage in that conversation, there's an opportunity for that worker to learn what they're seeing, what they're experiencing, and then here's the other piece. As they start to frame that properly, they can see the bigger picture of what's going on in that family. Unless you all as supervisors go out on every home visit with your worker, which I know is not possible, you have to rely on their ability to gather the information that's necessary to bring that back to you, so that when you then go to your next level of administration to talk with them, you've got good information. I think that a critical piece of child welfare poor decisions are because we don't have good information. And part of the reason why we don't have good information is that we're not teaching critical thinking skills to our workers so that they can gather good information and bring that information back. You know, I say all the time, child welfare is complicated because you're dealing with human beings. If we were just dealing with widgets and screws, it would be easy because everything would be the same. It's amazing how we try to shoehorn families into the services that we have. That's why I ask about parent training, because most organizations have parent training, so everybody's going to get parent training, whether they need it or not. We have to treat families individually. And the way that we get at that individuality is by having workers who know how to gather that information. And through coaching, they do a much better job of that. You know, most workers, most people who major in social work and come to work in the Public Child Welfare Agency are generally a little surprised at what they're doing. I think they perceive it as what we used to say, practicing social work at Disney World. Practicing social work in an urban environment is very different. It's very different. Most workers don't have the time to develop good relationships with their families, which is what generally we want when we go to school and major in social work. But we have to educate our people to be able to gather the best information that they possibly can through critical thinking and good decision-making to reduce the trauma to our families, and then be able to help them move forward without us. You know, some of these cases that I see where we have families that, quite frankly, it's like a family portrait. Mom, dad, son, daughter, child welfare caseworker. We should not become a permanent fixture in the families that we serve. Let me wrap this up with this. Child welfare is a very, very challenging job. There's no question about that. It disturbs me that I have an opportunity to see people who have made careers out of criticizing child welfare. Careers out of criticizing child welfare, even though they have never stepped foot in a child welfare agency. We have got to rewrite the narrative in child welfare. Gen Xers, Millennials, baby boomers, particularly the baby boomers like me, when you were walking out the door, I always believed that last year when I had decided to retire but nobody else knew I was going to retire, it was invigorating. I said what I wanted. It was empowering. You know, I would challenge positions because I already knew I was leaving. But what's that old saying? Dance like nobody's watching. We've got to make decisions like there's no consequence behind it. We cannot put our families in the trap of doing what we want to do simply because we think this is the safest thing for us, not for our families. We've got to turn this back. I thank you for your commitment to child welfare. I think this conference, this coaching conference, best idea I've seen in a long time. A long time. This makes the difference. If you want to retain your staff, engage more in coaching than in supervision. It's not about money. It really isn't. It's about their development, your interest in them, and their ability to demonstrate that interest back to you. Thank you all so much. I appreciate it.